Okay.
I want to welcome everybody to our basketball conversation series of the book event that we are sponsoring today. We have a special presentation and the author of the book to discuss her research on Morgan Shuster and his mission to Iran. And Matt, our research fellow, will talk more a little bit about that, and we'll introduce Joan for this talk. Let me tell you first that Basketball Institute has started with several book events this year, and Joan's book is the first one. We have other events coming, book events, one in November on creating modern space for Iranian women. And in December, we have a special book event on James Good publication, who has published a book about his experience as a Peace Corps person in Iran. So we hope you all join us for those book events. And by mixing the two, the lecture with the book, we are hoping to kind of bring greater attention to the publications on Iran that is taking place. So with that brief introduction, please check our website for more events. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Matt Shannon, who is our research fellow and associate professor of history at Emory and Henry College. Matt?
Well, thank you so much to everyone at the Baskerville Institute for organizing a second year of webinars. And each one has been very rich and has focused on different aspects of US-Iran relations. And today we get to hear about Morgan Shuster from Dr. Joan Gaughan. She will, of course, be speaking to us about her excellent book here, worth getting a copy, a paperback that you can travel with and read. But she served in Peace Corps Iran in the mid 1960s. So much of the talk will speak to the relationship between kind of earlier Americans like Shuster and Peace Corps volunteers in the 60s and 70s. She has a PhD from the University of Michigan, and she has taught at Washtenaw Community College in Ann Arbor for many years. Multiple publications, including a multi-volume set titled Milestones in Western Civilization, along with a book with Oxford University Press titled The Encumbrances, British Women in India, 1615 to 1858. Today she'll be speaking about her most recent publication, The Shuster Mission to Iran, Leaving Something Worthwhile behind. So I look forward to hearing more about what that something worthwhile was from Professor Gaughan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Shannon, and thank you too to the Baskerville Institute for allowing me to share with you the story of a truly honorable and good man. William Morgan Shuster was an accountant who in 1911 went to Persia, as it was then called, at the invitation of its Majlis to straighten out that country's finances. 6.5 months later, after his arrival, he was forced to leave, his mission in shambles. His story is inextricably linked with the Constitutional Revolution, the first phase of which had occurred in 1906. In 1906, the Persians had had enough of Qajar corruption and anarchy, and in July that year, there was a rising in Tehran and a demand for the dismissal of several notoriously corrupt officials and for the establishment of a house of justice. The Shah, Mozaffar al-Din, did dismiss several officials, but denied the request for a house of justice. That brought on more demonstrations, but the demand now changed from simply a demand for simple justice to one for an entirely new system of government. The Shah now had no choice but to acquiesce, and in August, he reluctantly ordered the convening of a constituent assembly. Elected on a partial suffrage by wealth, 156 delegates met in Tehran on October 7th of 1906 to draft a constitution. There is about this first Majlis an almost breathtaking optimism and a hope that despite its internal ethnic and tribal divisions and the fact that its economy had been largely mortgaged to foreigners, that an independent, truly liberal state could be created. By the end of that year, they had created a constitutional government that placed full legislative power in the hands of the Majlis, thereby ending the absolutism of the Qajar monarchs. There were no guillotines, there was no reign of terror, no embassy was looted, There were no anguished screams echoing from dark torture chambers. The members of the foreign legations slept quietly in their beds, as did the members of the royal court. Muzaffar ad-Din consented to the Constitution on January 1st of 1907, but died 3 days later to be replaced by Muhammad Ali, whom Shaw, I think rather charitably, described as a perverted, cowardly, vice-sodden monster. There were 3 obstacles to the implementation of the Constitution: 2 from foreign powers, Russia and Britain, and the 3rd from within Persia itself. The year before, in 1905, Russia had suffered a humiliating defeat by another Asian power, Japan. That defeat had ushered in a revolution exactly a year before Persia's that had forced Tsar Nicholas to allow the creation of a Duma, a parliament. He had not been happy about that, and he would not be happy either about a constitutionalist regime on his southern border. Nor was Britain crazy about a popularly elected government on its border with India, where a nationalist movement that included Muslims was already taking root. From within Persia itself, the problem was simply inexperience. Authority had always been a man, however much he might be hated. Hostility to that man, however, did not necessarily translate into loyalty to something as vague as a constitution, especially if it meant surrendering prerogatives that had long been taken for granted. Shuster would meet men who were perfectly willing to risk their lives to kill the Shah, but balked at the idea of paying a single toman in taxes. Graft was taken as a solemn rite of office, and law had been whatever the most powerful man in the room said it was, or whatever could be gotten with bakshish. For the obstacles presented by the first 2, Russia and Britain, Shuster would have absolutely no patience. For the 3rd, however, the inexperience of the Persians, he would have much more sympathy, even though many of them would vex him dearly and contribute to the failure of his mission. Muhammad Ali had no patience for the limits on his power, and in August that year, he gained unexpected support from the 2 powers who, with France, entered an entente cordiale, an alliance against the rising power of an increasingly bellicose Germany. Part of that entente included an Anglo-Russian convention. Negotiations over that convention lasted only 2 months and was signed in August of 1907. It affected Tibet and Afghanistan as well as Persia, and not a single representative of those 3 nations was invited or involved at all in the discussions. The convention split Persia into 3 spheres of influence. To Russia went the north, and that included everything down to just south of Isfahan and included most of Persia's 8 major roads. A neutral center angled to just south of Kermanshah and then along the Shatt al-Arab and included Shiraz, Dezful, and Bushehr. Britain got a narrow southern rim that included Bandar Abbas, and that gave Britain what she most valued, that is, an outlet to the Persian Gulf and thus control of the sea lanes that led to her jewel in its imperial crown, India. As far as Persia and Shuster would be concerned, the most important clause in that convention was a vow by the powers not to violate the independence and integrity of Persia. However, before the ink was even dry on the document, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, scoffed that the independence and integrity of Persia did not, in fact, exist. Muhammad Ali welcomed the convention. Since Tehran was in the Russian zone, he had an almost automatic ally against what he viewed as his mortal enemy, the Majlis. Throughout the rest of 1907 and the first part of 1908, despite the efforts of the Majlis to be conciliatory, relations between it and the Shah went from bad to worse. Riots were met with repression, which spawned more riots, which spawned more repression. Then in June of 1908, a nervous Muhammad Ali was escorted to a residence just outside of Tehran, from where he ordered the arrest of a number of deputies, and on June 23rd, about 1,000 Cossacks. Cossacks are brigades of Persian soldiers commanded by Russian officers. They surrounded the building in which the Majlis had been meeting and opened fire on it with the deputies still inside. The building was utterly destroyed, and those deputies not killed fled for refuge, many to Istanbul, where Shuster would meet them later. A miniature civil war had broken out between factions who were loyal not so much to Muhammad Ali as hostile to the constitutionalist government. The worst suffering fell upon Tabriz, where a vicious siege beginning in January of 1909 reduced that population to near starvation. It was in an effort to break that siege that Howard Baskerville was killed in April. By mid-July, however, the tide had turned in favor of the constitutionalists, who then forced Muhammad Ali to abdicate, and by a protocol drawn up on September 7th, Russia promised to keep him out of Persia in return for an annual payment for his upkeep of 100,000 tomans, this from a government that was totally broke. A second majlis was then elected on a wider suffrage, but it had no money. Persia badly needed financial help, but from whom? It was ironically a mullah who suggested the United States, which was then the standard bearer for constitutionalist governments throughout the world. Plus, Persians were familiar with the work of American missionaries, whose work has been studied extensively by you, Dr. Shannon, and by Homa Estelami from Fordham University. Unlike British and French missionaries, who, like the Americans, had indeed established hospitals and schools, Americans may have been disliked, but it was only for their religion. Their work was sui generis, not obviously connected with any overt imperial designs. So on Christmas Day of 1910, the UN State Department received a letter that requested American financial people, including an expert to serve as Treasurer General, to be employed for 3 years to reorganize Persia's finances. The United States had traditionally been anxious to avoid foreign entanglements. Moreover, the Anglo-Russian Convention had placed two formidable European powers in control of Persian affairs. Thus, President William Taft and his Secretary of State, Philander Knox, were at pains to point out that the American financial people, if sent to Persia, would have no official connection with the US government, which would assume no responsibility for its actions. Interestingly, at this point, neither Russia nor Britain objected to the appointment of an American advisor either. The United States was not then a great power, and its longstanding policy of non-intervention suggested that it would be no threat to the delicate balance of power in Europe, not professional diplomats. So the assumption then was that they would be fairly easy to manage. Morgan Shuster had been born into a prominent Washington, D.C. family in February of 1877, had attended Columbia University, which is now George Washington University, and then briefly practiced law in a D.C. firm. In the fall of 1898, he had taken service with the War Department, first as a stenographer, and then as Deputy Collector of Customs in Havana, Cuba, following the Spanish-American War. That service had been followed by work with the Taft Commission in the Philippines, first as a customs collector and then as Secretary of Education. In that service, he had earned the praise of Taft, but the scorn of the British ambassador to Washington for, quote, having taken up the cudgel for the natives. Later, the London Times would scornfully accuse him of the ultimate imperial sin of, quote, having thrown his lot in with the natives. And poor Shuster would wonder then with whom he should have thrown in his lot. Impressed with his service in the Philippines, Taft approved the contract with Shuster, and then Shuster, with his wife and two little girls, started for Persia in early April, and accompanied by 3 assistants and their families, landed at Bandar Anzali on May 7th. Bandar Anzali is what Peace Corps volunteers used to call Bandar Pahlavi. 5 days later, in the late afternoon of May 12th, the party reached Tehran, where they were housed in the beautiful Atabak compound, which had been built by a thoroughly corrupt former finance minister who had been assassinated after he built the compound. Ever the accountant, Shuster immediately counted the number of servants at the Atabak. There were 14, and he listed their duties and their monthly salaries in his diary. His first official visit was to the Ministry of Finance, where he met a Monsieur Lecoffre, a British subject of French extraction, who met him with the unpromising greeting, "Between the two of us, Mr. Shuster, we shall be able to straighten out the miserable finances of these people." And miserable the finances were indeed. Shuster found that the Persian finances, quote, were tangled, very tangled, had there been any to tangle. A visit he pointedly did not make was to the foreign legations. Underlying that refusal was the fact that, like the missionaries, that then, contrary to diplomatic practice, he had brought his family with him. To have called upon the legations would have suggested a diplomatic role that he did not have, did not want, and that the United States government very much did not want him to have. Moreover, to have made the calls would have suggested to his employer, the Majlis, a recognition of the legitimacy of their interference in Persian affairs. Indeed, so committed to the survival of the Majlis that its fate literally became Shuster's own. The legations never forgave nor forgot that slight, and he would receive no sympathy for them when his mission ran into difficulty. However, with the British minister, Sir George Berkeley, as well as with the Russian minister, Stanislav Poklevsky-Kozil, he would come to be on friendly, even warm terms. Both men would be obliged, often against their own decent instincts, to articulate the indecent policies of their own governments. Immediately, Shuster lobbied with the head of the Imperial Bank, which is the British bank in Tehran, to secure a loan from the British government for 1,250,000 tomans. With that cushion then, Shuster developed a bill that had three parts. One, there would be a system of collection for all revenues, taxes, custom duties, interest payments on loans. Two, there would be an inspection of all revenues and expenditures. And third, the Office of Treasurer General, that is, Shuster himself, would oversee all fiscal operations. That is, all government transactions, revenues, expenditures, or any other financial obligation that had to be approved by Shuster, and all accounts had to be kept on only one set of books. The Majlis passed that bill on June 13th. To me, that is the bedrock of the revolution. If it had worked, it would have given Persia the financial backbone that Alexander Hamilton had given us. But we had no interference from outside, and the Persians did, and from within. Everyone had assured Shuster that they were in favor of financial reform, unless it hit their own pockets. An early example of this was a Qajar prince who had, quote unquote, saved millions of tomans in his posts as a provincial governor, an army general, and a cabinet officer, but had never paid a single toman in taxes. When he went before the Council of Ministers to protest Shuster's efforts to collect his taxes, the ministers, who themselves also had been delinquent in that sphere, were so overcome with pity for the poor prince that they wrote Shuster a polite letter asking that the prince not pay anything until they could, quote, look into the matter. Shuster's response was that the prince could either pay his taxes or his grain houses would be seized. The prince's taxes were paid the next day. That incident, however, foreshadowed the beginning of a rift that became increasingly dangerous between Shuster and his supporters in the Majlis on the one hand, and the cabinet, who would resent and resist Shuster's efforts to bring any kind of integrity and order to Persia's finances. As he somewhat ruefully put it, laws in Persia, and more especially financial laws, were lightly regarded. To enforce revenue collection, Shuster decided to create a treasury gendarmerie. To head it, he wanted an officer from the British Indian Army, Major Claude Stokes, who had lately been posted to Persia, had learned the language like the people, and was clearly favorable to the constitutional revolution. He was due to retire in October, but was loath to leave Persia. He would have to resign his commission. On July 28th, the Majlis, under the impression that it had every right to hire officials who might contribute to Persia's defense, passed a contract to hire Stokes, and Stokes immediately cabled his resignation to London, assuming that it would be accepted. But no. The Russians opposed the appointment because the gendarmerie would be policing tax collection in the Russian zone under a British officer, and Sir Edward Grey caved in to Russia's objections. The issue remained unresolved. Shuster was able, with the help of several Americans, to train a pretty capable gendarmerie, but he never did get the services of Major Stokes. This was not the first, and it definitely would not be the last signal that while the Majlis and Shuster might take the independence and integrity of Persia seriously, the two powers who had made that promise did not. In early September, Shuster unveiled a plan that went beyond the June 13th law. It was a request for about 4 million tomans from a firm in London, the Seligman brothers, for paying down the debt owed to Russia, as well as for a bunch of infrastructure projects, including a national rail line that would obviously have transversed the lines of the Anglo-Russian Convention. The Seligman firm was willing to advance the loan, but Russia opposed it on the grounds that if Persia defaulted on the loan, the Seligmans and then thus the British government would acquire economic and thus political power throughout all of Persia. Ironically, however, the main opposition came from the cabinet, because his plan also called for the redemption of pensions, which would offend about 100,000 holders of them, including each member of the cabinet, who were already chafing at his insistence on honesty. The next month, October, would see Shuster's mission beginning to unravel. But by then, if not before, Shuster seems to have begun to view his mission as not merely a matter of financial reform, so much as a moral summons to support the Majlis in its effort to survive. In mid-July, Muhammad Ali, along with two of his brothers, Salar ad-Dawla and Shu'a Sultaneh, had invaded Persia with the object of regaining the throne. That had not only been a violation of the 1907 protocol, but it had also clearly been an act of open rebellion against Persia's legitimate government. So on October 4th, at Shuster's request, the Council of Ministers gave him an order to confiscate the estates of the princes and transfer them to the treasury. As a courtesy, the government notified both the British and Russian legations of the intent to seize several properties belonging to Shu'a Sultaneh. Neither legation responded. So 5 days later, on October 9th, Shuster sent out a small party to take an estate belonging to Shu'a, who had fled to Turkey and taken out Turkish citizenship in order to avoid prosecution in Persia. That estate lay close to Atabek, his headquarters, and also not far from the Russian legation. While the Shuster party was taking an inventory of the furnishings, two Russian officers with about a dozen Cossacks showed up and threatened them to leave immediately. Shuster had warned the party not to engage in any kind of violence, and they could see that the Cossacks clearly really did mean business, so they left. When Shuster learned what had happened, he immediately notified Poklevsky, asking that the British consulate withdraw its force from the compound. And the next morning, he sent Frank Cairns, his director of taxation, along with 50 Treasury gendarmes, to retake possession of the compound peaceably if they could, but under no circumstances to fire the first shot. When they arrived, Cairns placed the Treasury gendarmes at the compound and then went over to the nearby Russian consulate. There they were met not by Poklevsky, but by a character named Fyodorovich Pokhitinov, who as consul general at Tabriz in 1909 had supervised the siege of that city. Cairns' request that the Russian force be withdrawn was adamantly refused. So Cairns went back to the Shu'a compound, where about a half a dozen Cossacks, armed with rifles, refused to open the gate because they didn't have the key. So the Cairns group entered the compound by another gate, disarmed the Cossacks, and now, in complete possession of the compound, they proceeded with the inventory which had been started the day before. About mid-afternoon, 3 Russian officers showed up at the gate and began to viciously insult the government gendarmes, apparently with the purpose of goading them into firing. They didn't do so. In fact, nothing significant happened at all. Really, nothing at all. That really is the whole story, except that it's not. Pokhitinov, acting on his own, did next, without authorization from Poklevsky, his superior, is almost beyond comprehension. He sent in a report to St. Petersburg, wherein he claimed that the Persians had aimed their rifles at the Russians and publicly insulted them, which they, of course, had not done. When Poklevsky learned of his actions and of the report, he hit the ceiling and told Pokhitinov that if he had no excuse for his actions, he'd better find one. Pokhitinov replied that he would send up some papers, and this he did. He sent a messenger to the Russian Bank d'Escompte to get a certain document, apparently indicating that Shu'a had mortgaged his property to the bank. The document had no validity, and everybody knew that. In other words, the Russian government at no time had neither a legal nor a moral right to any of Shu'a's properties. Moreover, almost immediately, one of Shu'a's wives, the sister of one of Shu'a's principal Persian assistants, delivered Shu'a's will to Shuster, in which it was clear that instead of owing the bank anything, he had 38,000 tomans in his account, and his only debt was to his mother, to whom he owed 43,000 tomans, and he had been paying on that. Pokleski may not have known of the will, but even so, in 3 separate telegrams on October 12th and 13th, he pointed out to St. Petersburg that first, Shua was in debt to no bank, including the Russian one. Second, as a Turkish subject, he was not under Russian protection. And third, since Persian officials had given the legation sufficient notice of their intention to confiscate the properties, Pokintinov's actions had not only been unauthorized, but he had been given specific instructions not to meddle. In St. Petersburg, the foreign minister, Neratov, knew that Pokintinov's claim of Shua's indebtedness was a fabrication. But as he put it, it is entirely clear that we would never admit to this. About 2 weeks later, on November 2nd, by then the Russians had had time to think about things in St. Petersburg, and Poklevsky appeared at the Persian Foreign Office, Shuster said, like a man taking his medicine, to deliver 2 verbal demands. First, the Treasury Gendarmerie stationed at Shua's compound were to be immediately withdrawn and Persian Cossacks installed instead, a clear violation of Persia's own rights. And 2, the Russian government demanded an apology for the insult which had been offered to its consular officials. 5 days later, those oral demands were delivered in writing, but now there was an addendum. If the two demands were not met, the Russians would, quote, break off relations with Persia and they would take measures. And there was no doubt what the measures would be. Russian troops were already assembling at Baku. The Majlis would never agree to those 2 demands, and the cabinet could not act alone without the Majlis. As Shuster pointed out, if the cabinet was going to stand at all on the rights of Persia, this seemed a very strong case for them. But the cabinet ministers sought advice not from Shuster, but from the British government, who advised them to accept the demands, and then, in all probability, the Russian troops would be withdrawn. So the prime minister then ordered Shuster to withdraw the gendarmes from Shua's compound, which of course he had to do. And on November 22nd, the Persian foreign minister in full uniform walked into the Russian legation, seized the hand of Poklevsky, and apologized profusely on behalf of the Persian government for the affront put upon the consular officials in the Shua affair. Interestingly, the 2 demands in themselves were trivial to the point of being almost ridiculous. Was it really worth marching batteries of troops anywhere at all to avenge an insult, whether real or contrived? Moreover, with the stability of the Tsar's government in St. Petersburg not guaranteed, there was a question of how long Russia's hold on Persia could have been maintained, even if the troops had reached Tehran. Whether the Persians had intended it or not, however, they had called what amounted to a bluff on the part of the Russians. Had the Persians not accepted the demands, there might have been some excuse to advance the troops down from Baku toward Anzali. But could the troops now be withdrawn without achieving something concrete? So what were the Russians to do? Ironically, Shuster had already given them a way out of the dilemma. And ironically, it had very little to do what had happened at the Shua compound. On November 2nd, the same day that Poklevsky had delivered the 2 demands orally, Shuster had appointed the appointment of Monsieur Lecoffre to investigate, not to collect, simply to investigate the misappropriation of about 1 million tomans of the taxes for the previous 2 years in Azerbaijan. Despite the fact that the appointment of Lecoffre was fully within the Majlis's power to approve, it ran into opposition from the Russians. Lecoffre, was a British citizen, and Azerbaijan was within the Russian sphere. When the Russians objected to the appointment, Sir Edward Grey backed down. So on November 29th, the Russians then presented an ultimatum to the Persian government, which, although triggered by the Shua incident, basically had nothing directly to do with it. It contained 3 items. First, Shuster and Lecoffre were to be dismissed. 2, the Persian government was not to hire foreigners without the consent of the British and Russian legations, a flagrant violation, obviously, of Persia's sovereignty. And 3, The Persian government was to pay an indemnity for the cost of the Russian military expedition then entering the country. In other words, Persia was to bear the cost of being invaded. Further, compliance was expected within 48 hours. If there was no reply, or if the reply was unsatisfactory, the troops would then advance from Rasht, where they now were, thereby increasing the indemnity to be paid and obviously placing Tehran in danger. On December 1st at 11 o'clock, an hour before the 48 hours was to expire, the prime minister arose in the Majlis and announced that because there was such a short time left for any discussion, a resolution supporting the cabinet's acceptance of the ultimatum with all three of its items should be accepted. And then Shuster said, there was a dead silence. Then a young cleric from Tabriz, Sheikh Mohammed Khiyabani, rose from his seat, and Shuster says, he spoke briefly and to the point. It may be the will of Allah that our liberty and our sovereignty shall be taken from us by force, but let us not sign them away with our own hands. The deputies, there was no secret ballot, so each deputy had to stand up and declare his vote. When the roll call was ended, every man, priest or layman, youth or octogenarian, had cast his own die of fate, had staked the safety of himself and family, and hurled back into the teeth of the great bear from the north the unanimous answer of a desperate and downtrodden people who preferred a future of unknown terror to the voluntary sacrifice of their national dignity and of their recently earned right to work out their own salvation. Russian troops had already appeared in Gazvin, and the butchery had already started in Tabriz before that vote even took place. Throughout the rest of December, there was turmoil and a sense of hopelessness among the Majlis members. A couple of them came to Shuster and asked whether they should kill the cabinet ministers who were accepting the ultimatum, or should they kill themselves. Shuster advised neither course. His own life was in danger. Bullets whistled through the gardens of the Atabek as he worked in his office, and a newly arrived assistant noted that the dining room was interesting, with bullet holes in the mirror. From Istanbul, a leading Democrat in the first Majlis, Syed Hassan Takizadeh, advised the Majlis to accept the ultimatum because he said the whole world would reproach us for showing such stubbornness over a mere apology. And one historian sees the rejection of the ultimatum as belonging to the tradition of mystical martyrdom, quote, in the new garb of political action. Shuster saw the rejection of the ultimatum as neither stubbornness nor as mystical martyrdom. The Persian people, he would write, gave to the world an exhibition of temperance, of moderation, of stern self-restraint, the like of which probably no other civilized country could show under such trying circumstances. And he added, no one who knew these representatives of a stricken race in those dark days could fail to love the Persian people or to sympathize with their just aspirations. Shuster could only be fired by the body that had hired him. And on Christmas Day, the Majlis had to surrender and ask for his resignation. He and his family departed on January 11th of 1912, and then wrote, a few months later, he would write The Strangling of Persia, recounting his mission in Persia. Because it was Persia, there was poetry. Arif of Gazvin wrote these lines: shame upon a home when the guest leaves the table unfed. Give him your life and do not let him leave. If Shuster goes from Iran, Iran will go with the wind. Oh, young people, do not let him leave. God, let you stay. God, let you stay. The story of Shuster's mission is important, I think, for two reasons. First, it illustrates the banality of what in diplomacy is often called realpolitik. That is the idea that whatever entity has the most money, the biggest military arsenal, or the wiliest diplomats gets to call the shots. Or as the ancient Greek historian Thucydides sarcastically put it, the strong rule and the weak suffer what they must. Our most powerful weapon has never been our military arsenal, our technologies, nor our material wealth. Despite our moral cavities, and they are many and they are glaring, America has stood for something good. It has been our ideals, integrity, respect for the individual, the keeping of a bond once made, adherence to just laws, and respect for the right of folks to master their own affairs. To place those ideals, that integrity at the core of our behavior, not only with Iran, is not easy, and it may fail, as Shuster's failure shows too. However, as he pointed out, if these small nations are to be wiped out, if they are to become subject peoples merely because of their indisposition or their inability to become great military powers, the world will continue to live in centuries more of strife. Second, and related to that, is what Shuster left behind. We often speak of the generations of friendship between Iran and the United States. But friendship is obviously something more than simply the absence of hostilities. And I wonder if that friendship sometimes hasn't been simple fascination or possibly even a reciprocal deal that benefited both countries. We will give you this in return for you giving us that. What we could give to each other rather than a relationship than what we could be for each other. We can give a country planes and drones and financial investments and even humanitarian aid. But if we can't give them reason to trust us, we have given them basically nothing of value at all. In 2019, a delegation called Code Pink that included one of our own volunteers, Jackie Spurlock, went to Iran, and they were able to meet with Mohammad Javad Zarif, then foreign minister, who told them, our nuclear buildup was not to get a bomb. We just wanted to make the political point that you can't tell us what to do. We just want to maintain our pride and dignity. Only that. We do not want to be told you can do this or you cannot do that. Shuster failed on his mission. He basically left Iran with nothing tangible. But what he gave to Iran was something of greater value, that respect for Iran's pride and dignity that Zarif referred to, and his own honesty, his integrity, and his affection for the Persian people. It would be a shame, I think, to undervalue that gift. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really informative and comprehensive talk, Joan, and so much to learn about the experience of Morgan Shuster and how his, as you so nicely summarized, his integrity is adherence to ethical principle to his work and profession was really what drove him to do what he wanted to do in Iran. Now, their questions are coming in, but I'd like to first ask you one question about how did you get interested in Morgan Shuster and writing of this book? It's certainly a big, major contribution to American Iranian history, and particularly in terms of friendship. So tell us a little bit how you got interested to write about Morgan Shuster.
I meet with a young Iranian friend every Tuesday. And the day after President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, both of us were talking about it. And it's his remark that gave me the title of the book. Others have left, how did he say this? Americans have taken things from Iran too, but unlike the others, they have managed to leave something worthwhile behind. And obviously that connected with my own Peace Corps experience, which I had always thought I left nothing at all of value. And when my friend said that, I thought maybe what is of value isn't a thing, it's what we are, what we have been. And that's what Shuster left behind, himself and his honesty. And besides, I hate doing housework, so I figured I should write something instead.
Well, thank you very much. And let's look at the questions and answers. So we have one question from Dr. Essalami. Did Shuster ever interact with Samuel Jordan?
Did he ever what? I didn't hear it.
With Samuel Jordan, Dr. Jordan.
I don't think so, no. He wasn't in Iran that long. He was only there 6 months. And I almost have he's incredibly busy. I get the feeling that he didn't leave Tehran very much at all. There are photographs in the strangling of places in Mashhad, possibly Tabriz, but I don't think he was out of Tehran very often, and not for any length of time.
And there are a couple of questions in the chat room. Matt, do you want to address those questions to Joan?
Yeah, we have some great questions. And I certainly have some of my own, but we'll go through everything that's been sent in first, certainly. One relates to research and archives, and they're wondering if you came across any new or surprising insights from the archives that shaped or changed perhaps how you thought of Shuster and his efforts. And you mentioned the diary, but would there be other pieces?
No, not directly from Shuster. It was the diary that the strangling. There's a little bit of he goes back and forth in time, and the diary helps set that straight. So it's just basically the diary, and I don't know. There were some other things that I came across, but nothing. It was the diaries that was the most help.
Another question relates to just kind of the nature of Schuster's reformism and his reformist actions being kind of taking place within the context of a colonized or semi-colonial country, and they're wondering about whether or not a moderate version of Schuster's efforts had a better outcome, leading to potentially more sustainable financial or political reforms.
You know something, Dr. Shannon, I worried about that a lot. For a number of historians have said that he should have been more moderate. He should have compromised. He shouldn't have pushed the Stokes thing so far. And I came up with kind of an ethical problem. Can you do the right thing if you know that the consequences are going to be pretty painful for other people? And I haven't got an answer for that. I don't know if he should have been more moderate or not. I can't answer that honestly. I sympathize with his honesty so much. If he had compromised, would he have been less honest? Would the Majlis have trusted him if he had compromised at all? And I don't think they would have. The Majlis was already a fragile body. There were Democrats, there were moderates, there were all kinds of divisions within the Majlis. If he had compromised at all on the Stokes appointment or on the Shua affair, I'm not sure that he would have had the trust of that body to the extent that he did. And that he valued more than anything. He trusted that Majlis. He was devoted to that Majlis almost more than some of the members themselves were.
That's both of those questions are just really good questions. Gives us a lot to think about. I'm kind of curious about, you raised this ethical issue in your response to the last question, and it's something that comes up throughout your book. You write in the end here on page 284 that as you've kind of done the research and writing, that you started to see kind of a relationship between the Melian dialogue and Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War and some of the subjects that you came across in your research. And that's, of course, something that so many students read in liberal arts colleges and disciplines across colleges and universities. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of flesh that out a bit, help us understand kind of how the Melian dialogue relates to this story and how it helped shape your thinking, or maybe perhaps your narrative construction, or whatever it may be.
I taught that dialogue for several years. I think you all know the story. The island of Milos would not surrender. It was during the Peloponnesian Wars, and Milos was neutral, wouldn't side with either Athens or Sparta. So it's probably fictional, but Thucydides tells of an Athenian delegation going to the island of Milos and saying, hey, look, you can either be our allies on our side or we'll simply destroy you. And the Melians say, well, we don't want to be on your side. We don't want to be on anybody's side. And what have we done to annoy you anyhow? We haven't done any harm to you at all. And the Athenians say, that's the point. You haven't done anything to harm us, which shows that if we don't do something, that shows that we're strong, our enemies will think we're weak too. So again, your choice is either you can give up and be our subject, or we'll kill you all. And they say, and the Melians say, but that's not justice. And that's where Thucydides gives the answer. Justice matters only between equals. Even the gods don't care about justice. The strong rule and the weak submit. And that's exactly what I saw happening in Persia. The strong ruled, and the Persians were supposed to submit. And like the Melians, they didn't until the very end, until December. And that's why it was such a sad story. It was kind of like, don't we ever learn? Don't we ever learn from anything?
Well, that's, I think it just gives us so much to think about. So Shuster would have been like a member of the Melian Council interacting with the Athenians, I guess, as some kind of mediator or something.
Yeah, the question then does become, Matthew, and I'm struggling with personally myself, just because you see the right and the honorable and the just thing to do, can you follow that policy knowing that it's probably going to cost the lives of hundreds of, maybe even thousands of people who don't particularly care about your honor or your justice? And I don't know.
Ooh, well, speaking of questions of maybe justice or democracy, at least we have a question asking you to clarify the relationship between long-standing desire in Iran for democracy and self-rule. For instance, during Schuster's time, with kind of the sovereignty question as it relates to issues today, like nuclear technology. Is this, he wants to kind of, the question would like to hear you kind of speak to the relationship or not the relationship between those factors, I guess. The sovereignty question and the democracy question.
I'm not sure I really understand the question, but I think I've been thinking that if Schuster had succeeded, if that majlis had been allowed to thrive, there were difficulties within the majlis. I mean, there were the people who had been used to taking pensions, basically used to, robbing the treasury blind. But I think they could have worked this out if the Russians and the British had gotten out of there. The tribal problem, I think, was something, I'm not sure that the majlis could have handled that without outside help, because the tribes were very independent. So that was a big difficulty, and I don't know if the majlis could have handled that without outside help. But certainly not the kind of quote unquote help that Russia and Britain meant. I'm not sure I understand the question, because now I think what you're asking me to do is, if the majlis had survived, would Iran have evolved the way it has? Is that the question?
Well, the question, I'm sorry, I don't know if I did a good job summarizing it, but the question just reads like this: would you please explain, if you're comparing the current Iranian regime's desire to achieve nuclear capabilities that could lead to a range of capabilities, and the current government's history of repression with the long-standing Iranian people's desire for democracy and self-rule? I think we're just, that's the question.
I don't know. I think that was discussed at the Peace Corps conference too last week. Obviously, if you're going to call people names and keep up an attitude of hostility, you can't negotiate about anything, least of all nuclear issues. I think it was Mohammad Reza Shah that actually signed a nuclear non-proliferation agreement, which of course is gone by the board. I can't answer this question, Matthew. I'm sorry, I don't know. That's asking me to project something I just am not able to.
Sure, yeah, it's hard to relate the history to the kind of contemporary issue sometimes, as for historians at least.
I would say that the Iranian people are now what they were in 1911. They're still beautiful people. They still yearn to handle their own affairs. They still don't, like you said, they still don't want to be bossed around. So I don't think we should go in there and say you can't, like he said, you can and can't do this, but you can negotiate with Iranians, for crying out loud. And just, if you keep calling each other names, it's not, negotiations aren't going to happen. And I see this happening on the news. I mean, even on NPR, the minute Iran comes up, it's it's negative. It's like, of course, they're our enemy in the Near East. We've got to contain them or something like that. That goes nowhere toward any meaningful talk at all.
Mhm. That's interesting. We have a question here about, there is this dynamic with Shuster where we have someone who is kind of part of all these imperial networks, and he becomes, or he acts like an anti-imperialist in the Iranian case. And that's always something that can be difficult for historians to unpack. And the question is asking about how Shuster's task in the Philippines affected his later mission in Iran.
His work in the Philippines?
How Shuster's, yeah.
His work in the Philippines affected his
Right.
mission. I think it's kind of funny. He was a maniac for detail, and he had done really good things in the Philippines, and he figured that, heck, if I can do it in the Philippines, it should work in Iran. He had succeeded. He had done. He could see success in the Philippines. Why couldn't that happen in Iran? And it didn't. It was a different culture, and there's a little bit of noblesse oblige, I think, in Shuster. I can fix things. I can just do things. I'm an American. I know how to do things. Well, sometimes you don't. And I think if there was a flaw, and of course there was a flaw in Shuster, it was that he figured that he could fix things, and he couldn't.
Well, yeah, and then in the Philippines, he of course he was a citizen of the colonial power of the United States, so he was working under that protective umbrella. Whereas in Iran, he was an American in a Russian and British, essentially, zone of influence, which makes it much more difficult to get things done.
Yeah, and that's the thing, in a way, it was to his benefit that he was not a diplomat, that he was not an official representative of the United States. But on the other hand, yeah, it did cripple him because he didn't have the United States government backing him.
Yeah, and that relates to a question that we just received about how the events of Shuster's time in Iran correlate to the lead up to World War I, and how the Western powers utilized Iran often for kind of their own interests and proxy conflicts. Can you speak to the larger kind of geopolitical World War context of the Shuster period coming up right after Shuster?
The Anglo-Russian Convention, of course, didn't prevent World War. It could not have and did not prevent anything in 1914. It's interesting. While I think it was about September or so, while Britain was so worried about Germany and Russia actually got together at Potsdam and signed an agreement so that the Russians would stand back while the Germans spiked a railroad right down to almost the border of Iran. And the Russians, or the English, or the British saw that obviously as clearly a threat, because the British, the big enemy here was Germany, and here was the Russians, their partner in the Entente, siding or making a railroad agreement with Germany. And railroads were so important. There were all kinds of discussion and difficulty about railroads, because again, they did transfer across national lines. As far as World War I is concerned, this didn't prevent anything, obviously, we know that. And Persia was kind of, at least in Azerbaijan, very much part of the battleground, and not so much in World War I as from 1917 with the Russian Revolution, because the Russians basically, they were destitute, and they would, in the south, they would go into Iran, and it was sort of like Azerbaijan was part of Russia. They would go in and they would take firewood, they would take food, they would go into people's houses and demand housing. So World War I hurt Iran probably not maybe as much as Europe, but certainly a whole lot. What was the second part of this, Matthew?
How the events of Shuster's time relate to the lead up to World War I, and then how the Western powers utilized Iran for their own interests and conflicts. You sort of addressed both of those pieces.
I think, we've been seeing Iran, I think, basically, John Gazvinian does a beautiful job of showing how we've been, before the 20th century, we were fascinated with Persia. And what the Shuster mission did is turn that fascination into realizing that Persia was a real diplomatic nation. It was not just a cute place for carpets and cats. It was a real, it was an entity that we had to take diplomatically quite seriously. But we were, I think, the British then and the powers were more interested after World War I in carving up the Middle East. And Persia basically was seen kind of as a backdrop to what was happening in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, there. And Persia really kind of was in the background for carving up the Middle East after World War I. And of course, we weren't involved in that at all. But I think once the Persia became a diplomatic reality to us, it became something we could use. It became part of our thinking, I think, became, well, okay, Persia is there. We can invest there, but we can use it. It can serve our interests, and especially after World War II, it could serve as a buttress against communism, and hence the Mossadegh thing. And if it can't serve our interests, are we really interested in it that much? And I don't know, the government, American people went there and loved it, but the American government, I think, was seeing Persia simply as a tool. And that's kind of unfortunate. I think they saw it, basically they stepped into the mindset of the Russians and the British. And, if Persia can't serve our interests, then forget about it. So, we've been talking about these centuries of friendship. I guess one of the disappointing things for me, and probably for a number of other volunteers, we went over there like Shuster did, wanting to help, wanting to be honest, wanting to do what we could to be good. And it was a huge disappointment for us when we found out that maybe we were just agents of American policy, foreign policy. That hurt a lot. That was depressing.
Well, thank you, Joan. A question has come about whether Morgan Shuster knew Howard Baskerville's story. And he went to Iran in 1911, 2 years after Howard Baskerville died fighting for Iranian constitution. So somebody asked a question whether Morgan Shuster was aware about Howard Baskerville's experience and how he's received inside Iran, and did that experience of Howard Baskerville have an impact on the positive reception that Morgan Shuster received from the parliament?
I don't think Shuster could have known of Baskerville before he got to Iran. He only had 4 months to prepare, but he certainly would have heard of Baskerville after he got there, I think. And I think he would have sympathized with Baskerville because Baskerville, like Shuster, didn't get any support from the United States government. So there, I think he doesn't mention him at all. But I think he would have been sympathetic.
And the second part of the question was about other American missionaries in Iran. Did Morgan Shuster interact with others? I think in Urumiyet and in Tabriz, there were American missionaries at that time. And so did you come across any communications from Morgan Shuster that he had communicated with Americans inside Iran?
Something, I don't think he had time. The word anal came to mind when I was watching him work. He's just so frantically busy. The June 13th law, that's June 13th. It took him exactly 1 month from the time he got there to the time when the Majlis approved that law. And then he's frantically busy trying to get the gendarmerie set up. And right then in July, Muhammad Ali invades. So he's frantically busy from the get-go. And it's, he's dealing with the Russians and the British. He's also dealing with individual Persians. He's got to talk them into basically being behind his financial reforms. And that's a trick too. I'm not sure he even left Tehran very often. And there were missionaries obviously in Tehran, but I can't say that he interacted with them much. A lot of his interactions are actually with Sir George Barclay and Boklevsky. He plays bridge with those folks a lot. So it's not missionaries. I'm sure he was aware of them and sympathetic to them, but he doesn't mention them.
We have another question, Matt, I think came on the question and answer.
Yeah, we have a few questions. I did a quick search in the Shuster book before this event to look at some of these points, and mentions one or two missionaries by name, but it's a huge book, and they're like,
Yeah.
less than a handful of names that at least came up right away. There could be many more, but I don't think so. I'm just kind of backing up what you said, that his focus was a kind of a very specific group, and the missionaries are around, but not really core to his work, right? But the questions, there are two that relate to each other quite nicely. One asks if Shuster was ever asked to come back for a second term.
Yes.
And if he was, what the reaction was. And then
Yes.
the related question relates to how your view on the morality of the Shuster episode might shape your view of the Millspaw mission in moral terms. Do you think about the connection between Shuster and then Millspaw? So those are the two related questions.
Yeah, he was asked to come back by Reza Shah, and he didn't. He thought about it, I think, but he didn't go. And then, of course, Millspaw instead, and Millspaw, of course, stayed there a lot longer. Millspaw didn't have the affection for the Iranian people that Shuster did, but of course, he was seeing Iran at a different time too. Millspaw's from Michigan, my state, but he just doesn't seem to have I hate to use the word gentleness. He doesn't have the warmth of Shuster. And Shuster doesn't say anything about it. I can't find anything that Shuster says about Millspaw. There's one question that nobody's asking, but that question did come up with Kelly Shannon when she gave a talk on Shuster a couple of months ago. And that was whether or not Shuster was religious. And like Kelly, I agree that he was not. I'm not sure he was even spiritual, but he was dead set ethical. And there's a difference.
Interesting.
There's another question that didn't come up yet, and that's about Shuster's perceptions of Iranian women. I don't think there's anybody, no historian that I know of that I got to back up here. Shuster did notice the role of women. He noticed that I think it was 1907 or something. No, it would have been in 1906. A bunch of Iranian women handed Muzaffar ad-Din Shah a note that read, "Fear you, if you don't change, we're going to see to it that the crown is taken off your head." And then later on in December, Shuster mentions a bunch of Iranian women that went into the cabinet ministers with rifles under their chadors and said, either you reject the ultimatum or we will fire these guns on you, on our husbands and our sons, but we want that constitution to live. And of course, they failed. And it was also a bunch of Iranian women that wrote a letter to the Queen of England, asking her to intercede on their behalf. And the Queen's, I think it was the Queen, no, it wasn't. It was some feminists, some British feminists. And the answer was, we can't even get a vote here. We can't do much for you either. But the fact that they were so involved and so interested in what was going on, I thought was interesting. And Shuster mentions this.
Interesting. So Shuster died in 1960. Right, I think.
Yeah.
So did you run across any observations he may have had about different developments in Iran? Because the Shuster Iran in 1911 was very different than Iran in 1950. So did you come across anything that he talked about? He was a prolific writer. So did he write about issues in Iran? I mean, the title of his book, Strangling of Persia, pretty much indicated how he thinks. But did he kind of talk about other problems in Iran?
He did. He gave speeches for a couple of years. He became one of the founders became the Simon & Schuster Publishing Company. He did give speeches and he did write for a while, but then I think about probably the late teens or early 20s, he seems to have dropped his interest in Iran. I can't find anything after that. Sir Edward Grey came to the United States after World War I, and Grey by then was going blind, which has nothing to do with anything, but Shuster pointedly did not seek him out, and Grey did not seek him out. I thought that was kind of interesting.
We have we have a good question here about kind of friendship, and the question says that you stated the big issue, which is that friendship is not the same as a pragmatic alliance. What countries do you think the United States would befriend if it were against its interests? In short, is friendship always a pretense in world politics, a cover for achieving interests?
Don't know.
So do we have any, as you've thought about this kind of question of binational friendship in the context of US-Iran relations, have you kind of thought more about that issue? And maybe if the United States chooses that course when it's against its strategic considerations?
I don't think, how do you define a strategic consideration? I don't know how you do that. If you mean, you know, are you interested in oil, or are you into, I don't understand how you can really separate the two. If you can't build an alliance that's honest, you don't have much of an alliance. If you don't bring some respect into the people you're dealing with, your strategy is empty. I can't see that you've got a strategy at all if you don't have a fundamental honesty and integrity involved in it. Otherwise, it's not going to hold. It's that simple, I think. I mean, if you're going to keep calling Iran a state sponsor of terrorism, or you know, what's the other? We've got it, and the same thing with Iran. If you're going to keep calling us the great Satan, strategic consideration or none, you're going to go nowhere if you don't develop the respect that Shuster pointed to.
Well, it's interesting to think about. I mean, and the question gives Canada as an example, the notion that perhaps we think of a kind of friendship relationship between our neighbor to the north, but even in that context, as the question notes, that there are strategic considerations like border, and other things that, and trade and other issues that would be part of that kind of larger mix.
I think if you don't start with basic trust, if you don't start with basic respect, I don't know how you can build a safe world anywhere on any ground. I really don't, because whatever treaty you sign, you can sign nuclear treaties up one side and down the other. But if there isn't a trust that you'll honor those treaties, if there isn't an assumption that the other guy is honest and you're honest, I don't see how those things hold up, and they don't. I mean, if you're going to topple Mohammed Mossadegh because because he seems to be a quote unquote communist, what have you got left? What you've got are Iranians who can't quite get over that.
Well, the other piece, I mean, a question that I was going to ask, I'll just ask now because it relates to the friendship question. You know, as we think about what that means, anyone who's had a friend knows that it's a reciprocal relationship, and the relationships that aren't reciprocal don't become friendships. They acquaintances or worse, right?
Yeah.
So when we think about friendship and Shuster, you know, you write really, your writing is so nice. Your narrative is your lectures are so nice. I see some of my students in attendance, and I know they wish I could lecture like you just did today. But one of these passages that caught my eye that kind of relates to this question, you say, energetic, idealistic, honest, Shuster in many ways resembled the earlier missionaries who had preceded him, as well as many other Americans, including the Peace Corps volunteers of the 1960s and 70s, who would go to Iran with the motive of giving that country and her people something worthwhile. So the title quote. And there's this question about what Shuster accomplished in Iran, or what Peace Corps accomplished. And if it's an element of friendship, I would assume that something was given back to the Americans, right? It's obviously true with the Peace Corps group. And so with Shuster, I'm wondering, what did he take with him? What was his, if it's about friendship, what was the impact of that friendship on Shuster's life?
I don't know. I can't say, and nobody can other than Shuster. He loved the people. The dedication, when he wrote The Strangling, the dedication was to the Persian people. And hang on, I'm going to get the book. His dedication says a lot, I think, to the Persian people. in the endeavor to repay in some slight measure the debt of gratitude. And that was it. He left owing Persia. He didn't feel like he had taken anything. He felt he owed the Persian people something. The debt of gratitude imposed on me through their confidence in my purposes toward them and by their unwavering belief under difficult and forbidding circumstances in my desire to serve them for the regeneration of their nature. And that says everything, I think. I hope, Matthew, that answers your question. I don't, the question, what did he do anything about the relationship between Iran and America in the years after he left Iran? I don't think he felt he could much, because what he had left behind, I think he recognized that his integrity and his honesty did mean something to the Iranian people. And I think he was right. I think it's because, I remember a couple of days after Mr. Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, I got a notice on email. One of our former Peace Corps volunteers had run it. He was in Iran. It was either in Isfahan or Shiraz. He ran into some Iranians, and this was after, a couple of days after we had left the JCPOA. Oh, you're an American, hi, and come on over to my house. And the usual Iranian hospitality, no barrier at all. And I think that's due to the people like Shuster and to the missionaries and even to government people who tried to do their best. It matters. I think it matters a lot.
That's just wonderful to hear you speak about all this. It's kind of a different type of question, or it somewhat relates to what you just spoke to, but one question wonders how we can avoid exaggeration or over-exaggeration of Shuster and his mission and impact on U.S.-Iran relations. Can you speak to that?
I don't think it's a matter of over-exaggeration. I think it's a matter of under-telling the story. I wish more people knew about this story. I've got a bunch of first cousins that are nice enough to say nice things because I'm older than they are. And they were surprised when they read the book. They didn't know that this had happened. They didn't know that there had been an American or Americans that had entered Iran, loved it, and were loved in return. And what they saw was the Shuster story rather than what's been happening since 1979. They saw the good. They saw the beautiful part of the relationship, and I'm glad they did. And those are my first cousins. Go figure.
Bahman, do you have any more questions on your end?
I think one more question that has come in, and we really want to encourage everybody to get a copy of the book and read the book, because there is so much more details about the efforts of Morgan Shuster inside Iran, particularly his struggle to get the finances straightened out. And as Joan mentioned, he was truly a pragmatic person, a how-to-do person. So there's so much more details. So encouraging everybody to read this book, and it's written in such a fantastic, beautiful way, as Matt mentioned, that it makes the complicated issues that he faced with colonial policies, Russia, Britain, more understandable. And I think I appreciated what Joan has done in this book. He gave us a good picture of Shuster, and I particularly appreciated the fact that he took his family to Iran at that time in 1911. So it's very fascinating. So I ask the last question, you can stop screen sharing. So the final question is, how do you think the story of Morgan Shuster could affect the current conflict between the United States and Iran? If more people know about him, would that really impact the tension that is going on between the two countries?
I don't know. I would hope so. I would pray so, but I don't know. We've dug a hole so deep on both sides, it's going to be awfully hard to crawl out. But I think with good faith on both sides, we can begin to crawl out. I hope.
Thank you so much, Joan, for a fantastic presentation. I noticed that you wrote a piece for this talk, and if we could publish that piece that you just wrote for this lecture, we'd love to publish it in our website. And please encourage all our participants, please encourage your libraries also to purchase this book. And it is a fantastic book to read, and we're really delighted to have you for this talk, and thank you for preparing this fantastic presentation for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. Khadafid.